On a quiet, tree-lined street in the suburban neighborhood of Cedarwood Meadows, an air of serenity seemed to blanket the rows of neatly painted homes. Each house had a perfectly trimmed lawn, identical mailboxes approved by the local homeowners association, and small decorative flourishes that complied with the strict guidelines. The neighborhood prided itself on its visual harmony: no outlandish colors, no unapproved sculptures, and no fences higher than 4 feet. At the center of this heavily regulated community was the Cedarwood Meadows HOA, a powerful board of a few core members who oversaw all decisions. Most residents found the HOA's watchful eye somewhat comforting, ensuring property values stayed high and lawns stayed neat. But the association also attracted personalities that thrived on control. Among these was Gloria Harnell, though neighbors privately called her Karen. Gloria was in her mid-50s, hair dyed a shade too dark for her age, styled in a practical bob that framed her face in sharp angles. She wore business casual outfits even on weekends, carrying a faux leather binder stuffed with HOA rule printouts. If there was a bylaw about mailbox placement or acceptable paint swatches, she knew it by heart. While some residents respected her dedication, others found her approach stifling. She rarely missed an opportunity to issue warnings about minor infractions, be it a wind chime that supposedly disturbed the sound harmony or a garden ornament that wasn't architecturally consistent. Privately, neighbors called her Karen for her controlling behaviors and unwavering certainty that her perspective was always correct. Gloria was the de facto enforcer of the HOA's rules. Though not the HOA president, she effectively wielded more power, showing up at doorsteps with her rulebook, pinning strongly worded letters for perceived violations, and pushing for fines against those who resisted. The rest of the board often capitulated because few wanted to endure her relentless arguments. This carefully manicured equilibrium existed until the day it collided with an 80-year-old resident named Beatrice B. Mortimer, who had one abiding passion in her twilight years: her beloved Rosebush. Over time, that fragile Rosebush would ignite a neighborhood-wide conflict, pitting Karen's obsession with uniform perfection against the quiet dignity of an elderly gardener. Beatrice Mortimer, known simply as B, was a widow who'd lived in Cedarwood Meadows for nearly 4 decades. She and her late husband bought their small ranch-style home when the neighborhood was first developed. Over the years, she'd watched as the houses multiplied, the HOA bylaws expanded, and new, younger families moved in. But B rarely complained about changes. She felt grateful for her modest house, her friendly neighbors, and the tranquil street. At 80 years old, BEA's mobility had slowed, and her children lived out of state. She spent many mornings on her front porch, sipping tea and listening to birds. Her greatest pride, however, lay in a single rosebush that she and her husband had planted when they first moved in. It sat near the walkway, close enough so that the aroma of blooming roses drifted onto the porch. He always told her, "As long as you can smell these roses, we'll never be truly apart." Through the years, that rosebush had grown from a spindly plant to a lush cluster of branches, producing deep red blooms each season. B nurtured it diligently, pruning it, fertilizing it carefully, and watering it by hand. Neighbors admired the bright blossoms, sometimes asking if they could cut 1 or 2 for special occasions. B happily shared them, her eyes glowing each time. But now, creeping into BEA's golden years was the specter of the HOA's increasingly rigid standards. Past HOA boards had generally left her rosebush alone, considering it part of the original landscaping. However, in the last year or so, Gloria, Karen, Harnell had begun dropping ominous hints. She told B the bush's branches sometimes strayed beyond the walkway edge, or that its color, deep crimson, wasn't in the official list of recommended plant varieties. B, gentle and polite, tried to accommodate small requests, like trimming a bit more aggressively or bundling up fallen petals so they didn't scatter on the sidewalk. Yet, each time she complied, Gloria found something else to critique. B guessed it was only a matter of time before the rosebush, her cherished living memory of her late husband, faced a more serious threat. For Gloria, the rosebush was unruly, a potential trip hazard for passers-by, and not uniform with the other houses. She believed it undermined the consistent aesthetic that Cedarwood Meadows prided itself on. Though no official bylaw directly banned a rosebush, She felt certain she could interpret enough guidelines to justify its removal if she tried. B stayed optimistic. She believed that no one would truly force an 80-year-old widow to destroy her only sentimental link to her departed husband. She had faith in her neighbor's compassion. Yet the day was fast approaching when that trust in communal decency would be tested, and her beloved Rosebush would stand at the center of a heartbreak that galvanized the entire community. Late one afternoon, B was kneeling by her Rosebush, carefully deadheading spent blooms to encourage fresh growth. She relished the sweet fragrance, the velvety texture of the petals. Her arthritic knees ached, but she persisted, determined to keep the plant healthy. That's when she heard a sharp ahem. Looking up, B saw Gloria Farnell standing on the sidewalk, arms folded, wearing her usual look of disapproval. B forced a polite smile. "Good evening, Miss Farnell." Gloria gave a curt nod. "Mrs. Mortimer, I see your rosebush is extending over the walkway again. We must ensure it stays within property lines and doesn't impede pedestrians." B frowned slightly, glancing at the bush. "I keep it pruned. I can snip a bit more if it's truly in the way. No one's ever complained about being scratched or anything." Gloria pursed her lips. "We have to consider uniformity and safety. The walkway belongs to the association's easement. If the bush intrudes, that's a violation. I'd suggest you remove any overgrowth that might breach the boundary." She paused, scanning the lush roses. "Also, the bylaw states that all front plantings must be from the approved horticultural list. I don't recall seeing these roses on that list." BEA's voice trembled. "But this bush has been here for over 30 years. I never had any problems with the HOA before." Gloria shrugged. "Rules evolve. We can't let older exceptions undermine the neighborhood standards. I'll expect it to be trimmed more thoroughly, or else we might have to consider removing it." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving B shaken. The idea of removing her rosebush entirely felt unthinkable. She resolved to do what she could. She'd trim it back more severely, though it hurt her heart to cut healthy branches. The next day, with help from a neighbor's teenage grandson, she pruned the bush into a tidier shape. It looked less radiant, but still alive, still blossoming. For a short while, that seemed to appease Gloria Farnell. But within a couple of weeks, she returned, this time carrying a clipboard with official-looking forms. She left B a written landscape violation notice, referencing bylaw subsections about unapproved vegetation. The letter demanded that B address the non-compliant rosebush to conform with color and size standards. No direct mention of removal, but the subtext was clear. Neighbors who heard about this were incredulous. Many found the rosebush lovely. Some tried to talk to Gloria, pointing out that forcing an elderly widow to uproot her sentimental rose was cruel. Gloria responded with the usual lines, "I'm just enforcing the rules," or "We have to treat all residents equally. No special exceptions." All the while, BEA's anxiety mounted. She tried emailing the HOA board, but got a lukewarm response from the president, who said they'd review the matter. She sensed that Gloria wielded disproportionate sway behind the scenes. And so, she lived in daily fear of losing the last tangible link to her husband. The once joyful pastime of tending her roses became fraught with worry. But not even B, in her most anxious moments, expected that Gloria Farnell would soon skip the formalities altogether and commit an act so brazen that it stunned the entire neighborhood, spurring a wave of outrage that would transform Cedarwood Meadows. It happened on a morning in late spring. B awoke early, as was her habit, to water her rosebush before the sun grew too hot. She shuffled onto the front porch, only to freeze at the sight before her. Her rosebush, once lush with new buds, was gone, cut down almost to the ground. Severed branches and scattered petals lay in a mound near the curb. A pair of heavy-duty pruning shears sat discarded on the grass. For a second, B couldn't breathe, her vision blurring with tears. The entire bush had been mutilated, leaving only a few stumps of wood. She willed herself closer, a sinking dread in her stomach. This was no mere trimming. It was wholesale destruction. The luscious, decades-old rosebush that she and her husband planted so long ago had been effectively killed. A neighbor, Marjorie, stepped onto her own porch, gasping. She rushed over, exclaiming, "B, oh my goodness, did someone do this on purpose?" BEA's voice trembled. "It has to be. No normal pruning looks like this. She bent down, picking up a broken rose bloom, still half in bud. She recognized that it would never bloom again. Who would do such a thing? She had a terrible suspicion. Could it be? She tried to stifle the thought. Marjorie, outraged, pointed to something on the ground, a small laminated notice pinned by a stake. Bea lifted it, reading, "This rosebush is in violation of HOA standards and poses a hazard. Action taken to ensure compliance." It was unsigned, but the language mirrored the official forms that Gloria Farnell used. Bea felt her knees wobble. She sank onto the porch step, tears welling. My Bill's rosebush gone. A wave of heartbreak coursed through her. Within minutes, a small group of neighbors gathered, drawn by Marjorie's urgent calls. They beheld the butchered stump, recognized the style of the notice, and swiftly concluded that Karen Farnell must be behind it. Anger simmered. Joel, a younger man who lived 2 houses down, snapped photos on his phone. "This is insane. She can't just come onto your property and hack down your rosebush. That's vandalism, trespassing." Bea clutched a piece of the cut stem, voice quavering. "It was my memories. My husband, it was all I had left of him here." Hearing her despair, the neighbors felt their fury sharpen. They murmured about confronting Gloria Farnell, calling the police, demanding restitution. A phone call to the local police was made. An officer arrived, took statements, photographed the scene. But without direct eyewitnesses or a clear name on the note, the police were hesitant to make an arrest. They labeled it a property damage incident, advising Bea she could file a formal complaint or civil suit if she had proof of Farnell's involvement. Word spread like wildfire across Cedarwood Meadows that day. The sweet old widow's cherished rosebush was deliberately cut down. People called each other, posted on the community message board, venting outrage. Most believed Farnell's fingerprints were all over it, though Farnell maintained plausible deniability by not signing the notice. That night, Bea sat inside, tearful and numb, staring at her front yard's empty space. The same yard where she and her husband once shared laughter, planting that rosebush in hope. Now it lay in ruin. She considered replanting, but at her age, starting from scratch felt daunting. She feared the bush might never regrow after such a savage pruning. The heartbreak weighed on her like a stone. Little did she know, an equally powerful wave of empathy and solidarity was building among her neighbors. By morning, the entire block would rally around her, determined to rectify the injustice and stand up to Farnell's harsh cruelty. Neighbors refused to let Bea's despair linger. Early the next morning, a group of them met in Marjorie's driveway. They discussed a response, fueling each other's indignation. The sense of violation was palpable. If Farnell could do this to Bea, what else could she do in the name of compliance? One of them, a middle-aged teacher named Karen, proposed something radical. "We should all plant roses, on our lawns, along the sidewalk, wherever we can. Let her try to cut them all down." She half spoke in jest, but the idea struck a chord. Another neighbor, Tim, who had a large rose garden in his backyard, nodded. "We could line the entire street with rosebush cuttings. Show Farnell that if she tears down one, we plant 100 more." Murmurs of excitement swept through the circle. They recognized the symbolic power. Farnell tried to erase one rosebush, but if an entire block or more blossomed with roses in solidarity, it would overshadow her petty tyranny. People recalled how in other neighborhoods, small gestures of protest, like tying ribbons or placing certain decorations, had effectively signaled unity against overbearing HOAs. They hammered out a plan. Gather rose cuttings. Everyone who had roses, or knew someone who did, would donate cuttings or healthy potted rose bushes. Coordinate planting. They'd line the street on both sides, from Bea's house all the way to the main road if possible, creating a mile-long rose parade. Reveal the plan. They'd aim to do the bulk of planting within a short window, ideally over a weekend, so Farnell had no time to mobilize a counteraction. Involve others. Spread the word throughout Cedarwood Meadows, urging every sympathetic neighbor to place at least one rose plant in their front yard or near the curb. Even a few families who disliked Farnell butted heads with the HOA on other matters. This cause gave them a chance to push back. Bea, upon hearing the plan from Marjorie, initially hesitated. She worried Farnell might penalize them. But seeing the determination in their faces and feeling the pain of losing her rosebush, she agreed. I can't bring back Bill's original rose. But maybe this shows he's not forgotten. All the roses standing for all the memories. Within days, the plan took shape. Tim scoured garden centers, negotiating discounts for bulk Rosebush purchases. Corinne posted on social media, calling on anyone within driving distance to donate rose cuttings or potted shrubs. The response was extraordinary. Residents from neighboring subdivisions, also fed up with draconian HOAs, contributed. Some local horticulture clubs pitched in, even offering various rose varieties: red, pink, yellow, white, ensuring a rainbow of blooms. Even outside Cedarwood Meadows, people admired the story of an elderly widow's cherished bush destroyed by an overzealous Karen. They found it a perfect metaphor for petty cruelty overshadowed by communal kindness. Soon, pickups arrived carrying dozens of rose bushes. The local hardware store donated soil and mulch, eager for the positive publicity. Meanwhile, Farnell noticed an uptick in unusual gardening deliveries around the neighborhood. She grew suspicious, confronting a few neighbors. They shrugged off her questions or claimed they were just refreshing their landscaping. She became increasingly uneasy, suspecting a coordinated effort. But without official proof, she couldn't intervene. Then, one Saturday morning, the rose revolution commenced in earnest. A wave of neighbors spilled onto the street, spades and gloves in hand. They moved from house to house, planting roses near mailboxes, along edges of lawns, anywhere feasible. Some used large decorative planters, ensuring minimal chance Farnell could claim they were planting on common property. It was a carnival-like atmosphere, children helping dig holes, older teens distributing water cans. B. Mortimer, initially thinking they might place a few rose bushes near her yard, was stunned when she saw how far the line of new plantings stretched. By noon, nearly every house on the block had at least one new rosebush by the curb. Others had multiple. Some neighbors placed small stakes with messages like, "For B," or "In memory." A few spelled out lines of tribute. You can cut a flower, but you can't stop the bloom of kindness. Word spread, and more neighbors poured in from adjacent streets, wanting to add their own roses. By evening, the entire length of Pinecrest Drive, BEA's road, was lined with newly planted roses, forming an unbroken chain of foliage and buds. The variety was astounding. Hybrid teas, floribundas, climbers, miniatures. Some displayed immediate blooms, others would blossom in coming weeks. Tim, sweaty from hours of labor, grinned at the spectacle. If Farnell wants to remove all these, she'll need a bulldozer. Everyone chuckled at the absurdity. With so many participants, it was impossible for Farnell to single out every violation. At BEA's yard, the final crowning touch was a special rose arbor set near the stump of her old bush. Tim and a few skilled neighbors built the wooden archway overnight, training a new climbing rose to grow around it. They placed a small plaque reading, "Bill's Rose Lives On." B watched, tears glistening, as her entire block showed unwavering love. I don't have the words," she whispered, hugging each volunteer in turn. That night, the street glowed with porch lights reflecting off thousands of rose petals. A hush fell as neighbors admired the transformation. The mile-long Rose Parade stood as a testament to what happened when petty cruelty encountered unstoppable solidarity. Farnell, peering from behind her curtains, felt a pang of dread. She realized her singular act had triggered a massive show of defiance. Her attempts to maintain uniform aesthetics had ironically birthed a flamboyant rose spectacle that overshadowed every carefully curated rule. The following Sunday morning, Gloria Farnell stepped outside, determined to investigate the sudden wave of rose plantings. The scene that greeted her left her momentarily speechless. The entire street decked in vibrant roses, dozens upon dozens of potted shrubs, blossoming vines arching over walkways. The sweet perfume wafted in the mild air. Gone was the familiar uniform green of lawns unbroken by flower beds. Instead, a kaleidoscope of colors extended as far as she could see: pinks, reds, yellows, oranges, whites. And perched amid many of them were small tags or signs referencing BEA's plight. Some reading "Stand with B" or "Roses for Bill." Gloria's face flushed. She marched up to the first newly planted rosebush near the curb in front of a neighbor's home, scanning for violations. But the neighbor had cleverly placed it just inside their property line, in a large decorative planter. No official bylaw strictly forbade decorative planters containing roses. Tricky, she thought, heart pounding. She repeated the same at another yard. Again, they complied with the rules by ensuring it wasn't on common property. Her frustration grew, reaching a boiling point when she arrived at B. Mortimer's front yard. Where once there was a single bush, now a graceful arbor stood, entwined with young climbing roses. The entire area, though new, was meticulously arranged, no easy violation to sight. B herself sat on the porch, sipping tea, staring calmly at Gloria. "What is the meaning of this?" Gloria demanded, motioning to the arbor. "You can't just erect a structure without going through the proper architectural committee. Nor can you place so many new plantings without approval." BEA's voice was quiet but resolute. "This arbor is on my property, well within boundary lines, and built to code. If there's an approval form, we'll file it. But you've made it clear you'd prefer I had no roses at all. So my neighbors decided to show otherwise." Gloria scowled, looking around for some leverage. "You realize this is going to cause chaos. The entire street has turned into a floral riot. Our aesthetic guidelines do not permit random color schemes or multiple planters at the curb. I can't allow." B gently raised a hand, surprising Gloria with the firmness in her gaze. "You already took away my precious rosebush, Miss Farnell. This is the neighborhood's response. It's not random. It's kindness. And you won't force them all to tear out their roses, will you?" Gloria felt words catch in her throat. She pictured the logistical nightmare of issuing citations to half the neighborhood. Would the board stand behind her? The memory of the widely suspected vandalism weighed on her. She realized how the neighbors likely saw her as the culprit. Confronting them en masse might only confirm her guilt. At length, she sputtered, "We'll see about that. This is far from over." She pivoted and stormed off, ignoring BEA's parting remark. "You can't remove love with shears, Miss Farnell." As Gloria stalked down the rose-laden street, she felt an unfamiliar chill of vulnerability. She recognized that any attempt to forcibly remove hundreds of rosebushes would spark a massive backlash. And given the rising tide of public sympathy for B, the HOA board might well side with the neighbors. Frustration warred with fear inside Gloria Farnell. For the first time in her reign of strictness, she found herself overwhelmed, outnumbered, outmaneuvered. The spectacle of color mocking her obsession with uniform lawns. A hush fell upon her thoughts as she realized that in trying to destroy one old rosebush, she had triggered an unstoppable wave of blossoming defiance. By Monday, the story of BEA's Rosebush and the subsequent Rose Parade along Pinecrest Drive spilled onto local social media. Pictures circulated of the mile-long stretch of newly planted roses, with posts praising neighbors for defending an elderly widow's cherished memory. Some recounted how BEA's rose was presumably destroyed by an overreaching HOA member, fueling the blossoming protest. Reporters from a nearby local news channel arrived to film the spectacle. They interviewed B, who shyly spoke about her husband planting that original bush decades ago, and how heartbreak turned to awe when the entire street decided to bloom in solidarity. The camera panned across row after row of roses, some still potted, some newly transplanted, forming a rainbow of color. The anchor described it as a heartwarming example of neighborly unity in the face of petty injustice. As the coverage spread, the outpouring of public support intensified. Strangers drove by to see the mile of roses, snapping photos. Some left small notes or encouraging signs along the route. "Love blooms stronger than hate. You can't cut down kindness. Roses for B." The entire block took on a festive air. Gloria Farnell watched from her window, furious and helpless. She'd never felt so cornered, her usual intimidation tactics rendered useless by the sheer scale of the protest. She considered drafting mass violation notices, but realized it might lead to negative press for the HOA. She tried pressuring the HOA president to intervene, but the board balked. They recognized the PR disaster it would cause to punish half the neighborhood for planting flowers, especially given the suspicion that Farnell had destroyed BEA's original bush. Meanwhile, B. Mortimer found her sorrow easing as she strolled, slowly, with a cane, along the curb, marveling at the sea of roses. Tears welled up not from loss, but from gratitude. She saw a kaleidoscope of petals that somehow honored not just her husband, but the entire spirit of resilience. The community's display reaffirmed her belief in the goodness of people. One day, a letter arrived in BEA's mailbox. She opened it hesitantly, bracing for more demands. Instead, it was from a local rose society, offering her an honorary membership and free advice on cultivating her new plants. They'd heard the story and wanted to support her. Another letter arrived from an organization supporting seniors, praising Cedarwood Meadows for standing by one of its oldest residents. She shook her head in amazement. All this fuss, because of a single rosebush. Each time Farnell passed the street, driving quietly, trying not to be noticed, she glimpsed how unstoppable the wave of blooms had become. People sometimes recognized her car or gave it a pointed glance. She felt resentment, but also a flicker of guilt she didn't dare acknowledge. In her mind, she told herself she was just upholding the rules, that no one had proven she'd cut down BA's rose. But the magnitude of the backlash unnerved her. In a last-ditch attempt, Gloria approached the board with a proposed new bylaw limiting the number of front-yard floral species to 3 in subdued color palettes. The board practically laughed it off, recognizing it as a transparent attempt to quell the rose phenomenon. The motion died without a second. Farnell's influence had crumbled under the unstoppable tide of neighborly solidarity. Amid the daily swirl of visitors, media interest, and supportive messages, the newly minted mile-long rose parade stood in full, defiant bloom. And in BEA's heart, where once grief threatened to overshadow everything, a renewed sense of hope and community took root, blossoming like the vibrant petals that now lined her entire street. As if the daily spectacle wasn't enough, some neighbors proposed an official Rose Day to celebrate the newly planted bushes and reaffirm their support for B. Mortimer. The idea gained quick traction. Why not host a small street fair, inviting families to stroll among the blooms, sell homemade crafts or baked goods, and donate proceeds to local charities or a senior center? Word spread, and soon the entire block mobilized. They arranged for a Saturday event, calling it the Rosebush Revival Festival. Hand-painted signs went up announcing the date and time. Home bakers prepared treats, local artisans offered rose-themed wares, and even a local band volunteered to play gentle folk music near BA's yard. B, initially overwhelmed by the fuss, found herself at the heart of planning. Neighbors insisted she be the festival's honorary guest. They set up a small canopy and a folding chair for her to greet visitors. She agreed, though she felt shy, never having sought the spotlight. But the festival was as much about celebrating kindness and community as it was about her lost rosebush. By midday on the chosen Saturday, Pinecrest Drive bustled with activity. Families wandered up and down, admiring the wide array of roses in bloom. Vendors sold rose-scented candles, rose-themed embroidery, and rose-flavored lemonade. Children frolicked among the planters, careful not to damage the fragile shrubs. Bee sat under the canopy, smiling at the constant stream of well-wishers. The local news station returned to film the festival. Reporters interviewed attendees, capturing the upbeat atmosphere. One anchor even joked, "Never in all my years have I seen an entire block transformed into a living rose garden to protest one petty act. But here we are, and it's glorious." In a moment of pure irony, as the cameras rolled, Gloria Farnell wandered by the edge of the crowd, scowling. She seemed torn between wanting to protest and wanting to avoid drawing attention. When a reporter spotted her and asked for a comment, she briskly walked away, refusing to speak. Onlookers noticed, but no one harassed her. Everyone was too busy celebrating. At the festival's closing ceremony, Tim, the neighbor who'd helped coordinate planting, stood on a small makeshift stage. He held a microphone and welcomed Bee up front. "Everyone, can we give a warm round of applause for the reason we're all here, Mrs. Beatrice Mortimer?" The crowd erupted in cheers, applause, and scattered whoops. Bee rose carefully from her chair, leaning on her cane. Tears shimmered in her eyes as she looked out at the vibrant crowd, the sea of roses. "I can't express how grateful I am," she said, voice wavering. "To see all these flowers, it reminds me so much of the love my husband and I shared. I thought I lost it when my bush was destroyed, but you all gave me something bigger, more beautiful than I ever imagined. Thank you." A hush of emotion fell over the crowd. Then someone started clapping again, and soon the entire street roared with appreciation. Bea reached out to Tim, who gave her a gentle hug. The cameras captured the heartfelt moment. The festival concluded with a gentle guitar number from the local band, the sweet fragrance of roses drifting in the sunset light. In that instant, the entire block's act of defiance felt less like rebellion and more like a communal statement that no petty authority could extinguish the deeper bonds that hold neighbors together. By banding around BEA's heartbreak, they had created something unbelievably joyful. In the weeks after the Rosebush Revival Festival, Cedarwood Meadows returned to a calmer rhythm. The newly planted rosebushes needed regular watering, so neighbors took turns ensuring the petals stayed fresh. Some started forming a casual gardening club, inspired by the success of the mass planting. Bea found solace in strolling among the blooms whenever she felt lonely. Meanwhile, whispers circulated about the future of the HOA's leadership. Some residents openly questioned Farnell's position on the board. Others felt it was time for fresh elections or for Farnell to step down, given the fiasco. They argued that any board member who would stoop to destroying an elderly widow's rosebush, allegedly, didn't deserve to represent the community. Under this mounting pressure, Farnell's once commanding presence dwindled. She avoided confrontation, skipping or keeping quiet at board meetings, no longer patrolling the neighborhood daily. When she did appear, neighbors who recognized her often turned away or gave her a curt greeting. The sense that she was persona non grata weighed heavily. At the next HOA board session, Farnell formally announced her resignation due to personal reasons. She avoided specifying the Rose scandal, but everyone guessed. The few who had once sided with her found it impossible to defend her after the negative publicity. Farnell left the meeting with a forced dignity, gathering her folders one last time. The sense of relief among the audience was palpable. While Farnell never publicly admitted guilt for hacking down BEA's Rosebush, the implication was strong enough. She retreated from public life. A few neighbors spotted a for sale sign appearing on Farnell's lawn 2 weeks later, fueling speculation that she was moving away to avoid the ongoing stigma. The neighborhood, for its part, breathed a collective sigh. Freed from Farnell's overbearing hand, the HOA's tone softened, emphasizing neighborly cooperation over strict enforcement. The new board, led by more moderate figures, recognized how deeply the community valued personal expressions, like BEA's roses, that carried emotional significance. They began revisiting old rules with an eye toward compassion. Bea received word of Farnell's resignation from the board and the rumored sale of her house. She felt a bittersweet mix of relief and pity. "I wouldn't wish ill on anyone," Bea told Marjorie. "But maybe it's best for her to find a place where folks appreciate her brand of rule-keeping." Meanwhile, the roses thrived. No single caretaker existed. It was a communal effort. Some advanced gardeners joined Tim in checking each new bush's health. Summer storms occasionally battered the petals, but neighbors diligently restaked any loosened plants. A gentle hush settled over Pinecrest Drive each dawn, as if the swirl of conflict had passed, leaving behind only the sweet perfume of triumph. Months rolled on, and the mile-long rose parade matured. The bushes grew more robust, some climbing small trellises or creeping along fences, forming arches of color. When spring returned, the entire street erupted in a vibrant pastel explosion, blossoming in an array of pink, red, orange, and even multi-hued roses. Visitors from outside the neighborhood still came by to take photos or walk the petal-lined sidewalks. Bea Mortimer, though physically frilier than before, glowed with new life. Each day, she found a handful of freshly bloomed roses in her yard, placed in a small vase on her porch. A rotating cast of neighbors stopped by to chat, or to check if she needed groceries, uniting her final years with a closeness she never expected. The memory of Farnell's destructive act faded into a distant cautionary tale. In place of anger, the community carried a sense of triumph. They often recounted the story to new residents. "We had a neighbor who tried to tear out an old lady's rosebush, but ended up causing an entire street to bloom in solidarity." The moral was always the same. Kindness and unity can outshine cruelty. One warm afternoon, Bea sat on her porch with a tall glass of lemonade, gazing out at the rose-laden view. She breathed in the fragrance, recalling her husband's voice. "As long as you can smell these roses, we'll never be truly apart." She felt his presence in the swirl of petals. A tear escaped her eye, but it was a tear of contentment. He'd have loved this. At that moment, a child from down the street bounded up, carrying a small note. "Mrs. Mortimer, we wrote a poem at school about your roses." She handed Bea a piece of paper covered in crayon scrawl. It read, "Roses stand tall, for old love never falls. When they cut one down, 100 more shall crown." Bea laughed softly, praising the sweet rhyme. Later that week, the local newspaper published a follow-up piece titled, "1 Year Later, Cedarwood's Mile-Long Rose Miracle." The article described how a single act of pettiness had led to a blossoming revolution, unifying an entire street around an elderly widow's memory. Photos depicted Bea smiling among the profusion of blooms, surrounded by neighbors who had become like an extended family. And so it remained, a legacy of resilience and empathy in a place once overshadowed by petty enforcement. The community discovered that real beauty didn't lie in uniform lawns or abiding by trivial guidelines, but in caring for each other's happiness and memories. The story of the mile-long rose parade became part of Cedarwood Meadows' identity, a living lesson that the power of kindness can outgrow and outlast even the harshest attempts at control. Years passed, and though Bea Mortimer's health waned further, she never lacked companions. A rotating schedule of neighbors ensured she had help with daily tasks. The rose-laden street thrived, changing with each cycle of seasons. In winter, some of the bushes went dormant, blanketed by occasional snow, but re-emerged each spring in renewed splendor. Bea often joked that her late husband, Bill, would be amazed at the explosion of color. She liked to imagine him walking beside her, pointing out each variety, how unique some petals were, how glorious the entire street smelled. And from the intangible corners of memory, she felt his pride echo through her heart. The small arbor Tim and the others built in Bea's front yard became a community landmark. Engraved on the arch was a simple phrase, "Planted in love, blooming in unity." Tourists from nearby towns occasionally drove through, snapping pictures of the arch and reading the story posted on a discreet sign. "In memory of a rose that was cut down, and the 1,000 roses that took its place." Meanwhile, Cedarwood Meadows, freed from Farnell's stifling presence, continued under a more balanced HOA leadership. The new board introduced guidelines that respected personal expression while maintaining basic neatness. Residents discovered that a looser approach, guided by mutual respect, worked better than harsh uniformity. One spring day, a letter arrived for Bea. She recognized the scrawl of Farnell's name in the corner. Surprised, she opened it to find a terse note. "I heard you're enjoying the new roses. I never intended personal harm. I believed I was protecting the neighborhood's standards. Perhaps I was misguided. Wishing you well in your golden years, Ms. Mortimer." No apology exactly, but a gesture acknowledging the harm done. Bea sighed, partly relieved Farnell had shown a hint of remorse. She placed the letter in a drawer, uncertain how to feel. As time marched on, Bea's home remained a testament to how the neighborhood overcame cruelty. Each time a new family arrived, they'd be greeted by the sight of the Rose Parade, learning the story behind it from older residents. The tale of an elderly widow's heartbreak turning into a communal festival of flowers took on almost mythic status, proof that no matter how petty or harsh an individual might be, the collective goodwill of neighbors can bloom unstoppable. On the last warm day of summer, Bea found herself once again on the porch, listening to the buzzing of bees around the blossoms. The arbor's climbing roses swayed gently. She closed her eyes, letting the sweet perfume envelop her, and whispered a soft prayer of thanks, for Bill's memory, for the neighbors who stood by her, for the life she'd lived, and the legacy these roses would leave. In that moment, it was clear that the spirit of one small rosebush had transcended its physical destruction. Farnell's act, intended to enforce her iron rule, had accidentally germinated 1,000 seeds of solidarity. And in Cedarwood Meadows, those seeds would continue to flower in every season, reminding everyone who saw them that compassion triumphs over cruelty, and that true community isn't found in lines of identical lawns, but in the blossoming love shared among neighbors.